start with some of the essentials. So when and why do kids receive assessments for educational purposes?
Yeah, so I think the most kind of common answer and reason is obviously assessments are required to determine whether or not a student qualifies, right, for special education services. And so in order for that to take place, the assessment is the first step in the process. Also for 504 plans, there's an assessment component, but if and when a student already has an IEP, you can also, there may also be a need either on the school's end or the parent's end in terms of if they see additional needs arise and there's a concern, and there's a potential that additional services may be of benefit to the student. So assessments are for the purpose of determining if any special education services are necessary to add to the IEP. You know, if the answer is yes, then we take that information and add it to the IEP as a team. If the answer is no, maybe accommodations could be recommended, and or there are no needs.
And parents can request assessments at any time.
Yes, a parent or caregiver guardian can request an assessment at any time. And there are multiple areas, which I know we'll get into in a bit. But school teams can also request, you know, that students be assessed in, you know, particular areas. But in the state of California, it does require parental consent in order for those assessments to take place. So if a parent doesn't consent, they cannot move forward.
Okay. And what are the timelines around requests for assessments?
So in the state of California, assuming we're only touching on that, basically, let's go from if a parent requests an assessment, the district then has to respond within 15 calendar days in writing. So that either is delivering the assessment plan to the parent or a prior written notice expressing why they're denying the assessment. And then from the date that that signed assessment plan is returned to the district, that ignites that 60-day timeline. So in the state of California, they have 60 days to complete that whole process. We kind of touched on this last time. So that includes evaluating the student, writing the report, and holding the meeting to review the results of that assessment. That all has to occur within that 60 days.
Makes sense. And you account for obviously holidays and things like that. Yes,
yeah. Good point. So if there's any break longer than 5 school days, then the timeline pauses. So for example, Thanksgiving break is only 5 days, so that would not be a pause. However, winter break would be a pause in the timeline. So basically the last day of school before that break, let's say that's day 30, the timeline pauses, and then the date that they return back to school would be day 31. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Thank you.
One of the biggest questions we hear from parents is what type of assessments are even available, and how do we know what to ask for? And we're going to jump into different kinds of common assessments that can be asked for. But first, let's start with an overview of the types of assessments that are available for families.
There's so many. I know I kind of sent a list to Lindsay, so I'm not going to say all of them, but I think the most common assessments that I hear parents.
Dr. Pelangka, Donna's going to share that in the chat window. So as you're going through, Donna will share the link. She has the PDF in the chat window so people can open that and follow along.
Perfect. So I was going to say the most commonly, I would say administered assessments, and also areas that I hear parents wanting to have an assessment, but maybe they don't know there is an assessment. So obviously the kind of overall psychoeducational component, so looking at processing, cognition, then the academic assessment, so looking at how the student is performing either pre-academically if they're younger, or how are they in comparison to their same age peers across all areas in academics. Then there's like speech language assessments, or, you know, obviously a very common one. That's probably the next most common service under SAI, specialized academic instruction. Motor assessments, so fine motor, occupational therapy, gross motor, physical therapy. There's APE. That's one I find a lot of parents aren't familiar with, actually. So even though your child may not have like needs as far as physical therapy, but maybe they're struggling motor-wise in terms of participating physically with like sports or games or activities, or even on the playground, consider an adaptive PE assessment. I guess to kind of follow that line of thought, like a recreation and leisure assessment is one many people don't know exists. Yeah. Again, if they're struggling with playing or socialization, that's a good one. there's assessments for social emotional needs. So looking at intensive individualized counseling on the school setting. The two most common I get from parents that either don't know exist or want to be assessed in is a functional behavior assessment. So if the student is struggling with behavior in the school setting, and also one-to-one aids. So a lot of parents don't know that there is an assessment for that. Personally, I think it's very subjective, and an FBA should just kind of envelop that. But nonetheless, there's an assessment process. So if a parent does want an aid, they should initiate that request.
And that's eye-opening for me. I mean, the list that Donna shared in the chat window that you put together with us, Dr. Pelangka, is just like, yeah, I thought you could count them on 5 fingers, but it seems like there's an assessment for everything. And what it's for parents, I mean, definitely check out the list so that can help you think about where you might have concerns, what assessments might be available. But yeah, how to think about can you ask for anything to be assessed? Like one question we got prior to today was, if our child is in general ed, can we ask that someone assess the environment and efficacy of their inclusion program, as an example?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I should kind of preface it with, parents shouldn't just kind of run out there and say, I want my child assessed in all of these 20 areas. They're only required to be assessed and evaluated if it's an identified area of suspected need. So it is possible for the district to deny, a request for an assessment if there's absolutely no reason to think that. So for example, if you have a student that's really only showing like articulation errors or, potentially some sort of mild speech delay, but academically they're doing great, you don't necessarily have to put that child through a full psychoeducational cognitive academic assessment. They may only get a speech and language assessment because that's all we're looking at. So just being aware of that. And it's a lot. It takes a toll on a child to get all of this done, and it takes them away from their classroom and being educated. So just being mindful of that. And now I forgot your question.
Yeah, so this question specifically was about inclusion, like assessment environment. Yeah.
An inclusion specialist. So you can absolutely request an assessment to look at, I don't really think there's a formal name for it, just like an inclusion assessment, I guess, but having an inclusion specialist come in, they're very rare birds. There aren't many districts that have an on-deck inclusion specialist. So oftentimes they're contracted, but absolutely having that assessment, being considered to determine, is the environment, adequately supporting your child's needs when they're, being included in the gen ed setting.
So this would, just going back to your earlier point, this would be, you would, as a parent, you would say there's an identified need and or gap in delivering on least restrictive environment for my child who's in an inclusive setting, and you would make a case that we need to bring in an inclusion specialist to assess the environment and efficacy.
I think the most common use of an inclusion specialist, and specifically the assessment, is whenever there's a recommendation for a change in placement to a more restrictive setting.
I see.
If they're trying to remove your child from gen ed to a special day class, and or your child's been in an SAI setting for an extended period of time, and you've been requesting a shift to more inclusion and they're denying that. I feel like that's the time when it would make sense to say, hold on, like, let's look at, with the former example, the students already in gen ed, let's look at if it's being done properly, bring in this assessment and this assessor before shifting to a more restrictive setting. And if it's the latter, let's do what we call like a diagnostic placement for 30 to 60 days and have this inclusion specialist come in and come back to the table before we completely deny that this can be effective.
Got it.
And we also got a question from the chat window, and we hear this a lot. Can a parent ask for a specific test to be done as part of the assessment? Like, so not just, this is a general area of need, and it says, for example, to specifically ask for the TAL 4, but whatever of their, can parents request?
So legally they cannot. Basically the way it works is the law really defers to the specialist and the expert and kind of leaves that up to them, and says that they have the kind of knowledge to determine which assessment tools they want to use, as long as they're assessing in the identified area of need. However, it is possible to to make those requests and throw them in, especially if they've done their assessment and you feel like something is missing. Autism is a very common one, right? They like to rule it in or out. Typically when it's ruled out, like they've only done an ASRS or a CARS, like these rating scales. So I'll say, well, where's the ADOS? Like all you did was hand these questionnaires to people, but you didn't do any direct assessment with the child. So I always kind of recommend, don't ever rule it out if you're really thinking it's there until an ADOS has been done. And I've never had a district deny that. You know, same thing, if you feel like they're missing processing areas, I see that all the time. You can request that they go back and add those assessments. So you
After the fact.
you can,
You
yeah.
can request after the fact.
You can preface it and say, just want to make sure that you know we're going to be looking for an ADOS and we're going to be looking for X, Y, and Z. And it's usually taken, you know, again, unless it's some outlandish request, I don't really see it as ever being an issue. But you can't like tell them you're only going to use this instrument. You're only going to, you know what I mean? And I have found that particularly with school psychologists, they really have a preference for which tools they like to use. Like different school psychs really prefer one over the other. So.
And I know we touched on this the last time we spoke, but you know, it bears repeating. How can parents look at a completed assessment and determine if it's a valid and reliable assessment? What do we need to look for?
Right.
Again, you're looking for if this is looks like your child, but like I really like the way that you break it down.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's the kind of most basic answer is if you're reading this assessment and this report, does it sound like your child? Does it sound like the person you know? Because at the end of the day, you know your child better than anyone. And a lot of these assessors, especially if it's in the very beginning, if this is an initial, don't know your child at all, aside from the very little time they've spent assessing them. So that's the first point is, does it sound like this can be your child? And if not, probably something is off, right? However, I also will ask parents, like, have you observed your child at school? Because kids do, you know, perform differently in different settings. So it's possible. Have you sent anyone to observe? Have you requested that they send videos? If you have a lot of questions, I definitely recommend that. Other things to determine the validity, we kind of touched on last time, you know, how long did they actually spend with your child? I actually had one this week where collectively the psychologist and the speech therapist combined only spent 40 minutes total with this child. Like that's insane. So you obviously can't really discern much with 20 minutes with a student and then write this whole report and make a determination. So time, you know, also looking at, what was I going to say? The testing instruments used. We touched on this last time too. Assuming this is a child where this isn't the initial assessment, if you know that your child has, for example, an underlying expressive language disorder, and then the only cognitive instruments they're using are verbal, then their cognitive scores are going to come out low because of an underlying language impairment. So you, as a parent, you have to really kind of know that and be mindful of saying, well, did you do any nonverbal cognitive measures to kind of remove that confounding variable, right? Like, obviously my child is going to present as much lower performing if you're requiring all this verbal output when he has an expressive language disorder. So that's a huge piece to the validity, is taking into consideration the child as a whole. So if you, that's the biggest one I see oftentimes. Also attention is huge. If you have a child with like ADHD, and then it's coming out as there's all these low scores, like how much of that is impacted by the attention? You know, is it truly that this student can't produce these skills and can't perform, or is it being confounded and impacted by the attention? So that's really the bigger picture of really parsing out, you know, the assessments as a whole.
So would we ask those questions before, again, I know you're saying after, but even for the, like for, if we go to the verbal question about, so before those assessments are starting, is that something that we should say like, okay, great, make sure that you have this, this, and this in place? Or should we be waiting after to look and say, how did you get this score? You know, did you use proper, you know, was proper assessment been given in ways that this child can understand?
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally, at the end of the day, we would hope that as the experts, they would know what to administer and not to administer. So parents really shouldn't be given the burden of having to do that, right? We shouldn't have to tell them how to do their job. So I think that's why it tends to happen after the fact, because that's not the parent's job. I mean, the point of this is me kind of giving parents that information, but at the end of the day, it's not their job. So if they get this report and they see that that's what's happening and that there's holes, then absolutely, that's when you get into like IEE requests, right? And things like that. It's an invalid assessment.
And Carrie made a great comment in the chat window. She said, I feel like it's hard to make a case and know specifics if we aren't observing the class. And I know you mentioned that parents can, and we always hear, I know schools have rules, about observing. What is a reasonable amount of time that a parent can request? Because a lot of us here, sure, you can come for 20 minutes. So what is a reasonable expectation?
In terms of restricting the amount of time, there's really not much parents can do about it other than schedule multiple observations. So I think that's been kind of a new thing over the recent years, where in the past, quite honestly, they would just say, okay, great, go ahead to this classroom down the hall, have fun, we'll see you when you're done. And now if you notice, you're getting accompanied, right? Like the principal is going with you, or the psychologist is going with you to accompany you. And that's a liability issue. There had been people going in and seeing things, and obviously seeing things that shouldn't be happening. And then there's lawsuits. So, I think rather than kind of focusing on, I want to see my kid all day, or I want to see my kid for this extended period of time, make sure you're going during the times of concern. So if you want to see recess, schedule it for recess. If you want to see math, schedule it for math. And then you can schedule multiple observations. I also think it's fair to say that a teacher they're going to be impacted if a parent's sitting in there for hours and hours, right? And it's going to impact the classroom. So to be fair, like, we have to kind of understand that piece of it as well.
Yeah, makes sense. You touched on this from I think a different perspective, but just to kind of clarify, can we request accommodations for assessments? So, thinking about the receptive language point, like, can we request an advance accommodations around those kinds of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for standardized assessments, they cannot be accommodated in any way. So the reason being, the whole point of it is to look at the gap, right? So we're looking at how this student is performing in whatever area we're talking about, let's say math, in comparison to same age peers, to determine if there is a need. And so if we're giving them accommodations, then we're not able to see that true need. So for standardized assessments, which is pretty much the bulk of what you're going to be seeing in like a triennial or a psychoeducational evaluation, the answer would be no. However, you do need to ensure that the assessments that are being run make sense for that child. So kind of like Lindsay and I were talking about earlier, if it's a student who only communicates via AAC, then you have to ensure that the tests you're doing to look at their processing and their ability to do whatever the skills are, whether it's academic or cognitive, take into account that it's an assessment that's been proven to be valid and reliable for someone that uses AAC. So it wouldn't be an accommodation. It would just be something that's been standardized for that population, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah.
It does. There's so many variables. Like, everything you're saying, it's like, oh my gosh, like I feel like, I want to start sweating just because before I ask the next question about psychoeducational assessments, I mean, is there anything you want to say to parents? I like what you said before about like, it shouldn't be our job, but it feels like we have to be on every single detail or something could get dropped. And I know a lot of the parents, I can feel that pressure coming from them as well in the questions. Is there anything you want to say to parents to sort of relieve that pressure or not, but how should we be thinking about it when we feel like, oh my gosh, if I'm not asking if they're assessing this, is it valid, but is that accommodation? And how do I know if there's, assessing in all the areas? And okay, maybe I'm just speaking for myself in the way that my mind doesn't stop, but I'm sure there's somebody out there that can relate. What do you want to say to those of us who wake up thinking about assessments in the middle of the night?
Stop doing that. First of all, you're crazy. There was a lot in that question. So I guess just to kind of finalize the point about accommodations, like, you cannot accommodate a standardized assessment. It doesn't make sense. It defeats the purpose. If you're talking about like state testing or within the classroom testing, that's completely different. We know that these learners learn with certain accommodations, it's not changing what they're learning, it's changing how they're accessing that content. So they're still being tested on the same thing, just maybe they'll have, more time or whatever. But you're only going to know that those accommodations are needed if you can first see how they perform without those accommodations. Does that make sense? So they have to go through that process, right? You can opt out of, an evaluation and just do a records review, but that's very rarely recommended. So that's that piece. In terms of knowing that they're going to do their job right before they assess your child, I mean, it's going to take a lot of research and understanding what tests are out there, but you can absolutely do that and consult or look into help getting consultation from someone who's familiar with what those assessments can look like and should be for your particular child. Like I said, if it's a student with AAC, there's very specific assessments, right? So you can definitely become knowledgeable on that and make sure you're holding the district accountable and saying, I just want to make sure that that my child is, an AAC user, and these are the types of assessments that you're going to be using. And also, are they familiar with assessing that population? If they're not, then you should ensure that the district finds somebody who is, because then your results absolutely will not be valid. If they've never assessed a student that only communicates via AAC and this is the first time, they're not going to know what they're doing. So they need to refer out, right?
Right. That's huge. And so, we were starting to get some questions about specifics. So we do want to dive into some of the, the more, first, the more commonly used assessments, psychoeducational assessment, obviously. So what is it? And you kind of touched on this before, but just to reiterate, does every student with an IEP receive a psychoeducational assessment? What do we need to know?
No, so the psychoeducational assessment encompasses the cognitive and processing pieces. It also generally encompasses, it's all the pieces that are done by the school psychologist. So that would be cognitive, processing, sometimes academic, depends, and then any social emotional pieces. So looking at behavior that could be impacted, attention. So if there's an attention component that may be impacting, and adaptive. Not every student who is either looking to be qualified for special education and or already has been qualified for special education requires that. Like I said, if it's just a speech language IEP and that's all that's happening, they're only going to get an assessment from the speech language pathologist. So it's just dependent on the reason as far as why the student has the IEP.
And can this assessment be weaponized by the district? I mean, for example, can it be used to determine placement or keep a child out of gen ed?
So the technical legal answer is no. You can never solely use assessment scores to dictate placement. However, literally the IEP I had just before I came here attempted to do that. So they literally assess this student who's in all gen ed classes right now, with the exception of directed studies, and brought in an SAI teacher, claimed she was a consultant, and said, I just want you to see how low all of his academic scores are. He's also an African-American student, and they did cognitive standardized testing. But anyway.
Do you want to say why? Some people might not understand that statement. Do you want to explain why?
So in the state of California, there's a very archaic law, the Larry P. ruling, but basically in a nutshell, we're the only state who is not allowed to administer IQ tests and standardized cognitive scores for any student who identifies as African American. And there's actually a whole plethora of assessments that can't be used and standardized. But anyway, so they did that. And then they used these Wyatt scores that almost all of them were in the low to extremely low, and just didn't even explain the testing to parent, didn't explain what was happening, just showed her this graph and said, so we just wanted to let you know that he's performing really low and we think he may be a good candidate for an SAI class, which is why we have our consultant here. Did you want to speak to that? And literally just asked her one question. Are these the test scores that are most commonly seen in the students who attend your class? And she said, yes, it is. And that was it. I blew my mind. I lost my mind, Lindsay. It was so bad. But so they attempt, yes, and they will try to use it against, I shouldn't say against, but as a rationale to argue that, for instance, this child, because they have such low scores, can't possibly be successful in a gen ed setting. And it's absolutely not a legal way to go about it.
What
But
can a parent say if they don't have you sitting next to them in an IEP? But I know this is like a deep rabbit hole, but saying like, what is the response to that? That, because if we're talking about assessments and they are being used to try to say, well, then, so what can a parent say in that circumstance? Because unfortunately, as we all know, I'm sure that's way, way too common.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. Well, first of all, telling them flat out, I'm sorry, but as a member of this team, I'm well aware that test scores alone cannot be used to dictate placement. We need to continue to go through the IEP and look at goals. Goals drive services and services drive placement. Like for this particular example, this kid is in all gen ed classes and is passing with his lowest score. He has 1C. So why are we talking about moving him to SAI classes? It makes no sense. So you have to look at all the information as a whole. You need to consider goals and accommodations and services before you look at placement. And again, this is where an inclusion specialist can come in. If you're talking about pulling my kid out just because he has these scores, then let's talk more about how we can help him be successful, even though he already is in his gen ed classes. So there's a lot of things that parents can say, but I think the most important, knowing that absolutely it would be a predetermination, which is illegal, and test scores alone never can dictate placement.
And this gets to a question we had, which is the flip side of this conversation, which is we heard from a family whose son is significantly below grade level. According to teacher data, he's not meeting his IEP goals, but his scores put him in the average or low average range. And the district wants to exit him from SPED. And so this is the same point you're making, right? Like, the scores alone can't be used for that.
Yeah, so I see situations like that as well. Again, my first thought would be, are the test scores valid? So parents can absolutely request to have an IEE in a case like that and have the student looked at again. But taking into consideration everything, if he's scoring average on these scores and maybe it was valid and in a one-on-one setting, he's able to perform higher, but then you say, okay, maybe he was able to do that with you in this small confined space, but he's not able to apply that in the classroom. So we need to ask ourselves why, like what's going on? Is it attention related? Is it sensory related? Is it just, there's so many possibilities. And looking at his grades, looking at teacher interviews, looking at those report measures, looking at all of it. That's why it's so important to do, the whole shebang. That's my professional word today, shebang.
I like it.
Technical word.
I also wanted to ask, because you touched on sort of the school psychs are administering these tests. So is a school psych qualified to administer any psychoeducational or cognitive test?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Well, when you were saying like it could be, maybe it's the first time a district is assessing somebody who uses AAC, right? So they're not going to know how to do that. And so I know I've heard from a lot of parents concern of like, well, okay, the school psych is doing, some specific tests, but are they qualified to do any, or is it something where if a parent is wanting certain cognitive tests to, is a school psych, are they fine to do any of these tests, or should we maybe consider someone more specifically?
No, there are definitely certain testing instruments that cannot be administered by like any school psych. So the NEPSI is one. A NEPSI is used for looking at attention, and you have to be, I'm not going to know the name off the top of my head, but there's a certain, I think it's a neuropsych type component to their credential that they have to have. The ADOS, you have to be ADOS certified. The school psych is who administers the autism testing as well. And so if you're not ADOS certified, you can't administer that. So I have seen it, be the case where when that's requested, they have to have someone else within the district or even find someone outside of the district to do it. So there are different testing instruments that require different certifications or levels of credentialing. And then again, they may be qualified to administer a test, but not familiar with it. It's just like a BCBA. Like if I've never worked with a population of individuals who have OCD, I'm not going to consider myself the expert on helping people with OCD. Like I need to consult, right? So it would be the same for any professional.
Yeah, that makes sense. This is on the AAC side of things. Districts and parents, including this person, sometimes use AAC and AT interchangeably, yet they're distinct assessments and services. Can you help me understand and others who might not understand what the difference is?
Yeah, so some districts do kind of put them both under the same assistive technology umbrella, but there are, differences. So AT is assistive technology. AAC could technically be considered a kind of a sub compartment of assistive technology, but AAC specifically refers to assistive and augmentative communication. So that is strictly a communication assessment. So looking at if a student, and it can be low tech to high tech, it's not just looking at, high tech devices. It could be looking at visual schedules or, just basic visual static boards or whatever it is that's much more low tech. Whereas assistive technology and AT assessment doesn't look at the communication piece. It's looking at how to help the student access the academics within their environment via additional technological tools. So that could even be something as low tech as adaptive scissors. That's considered assistive technology. A calculator, a pencil grip, to high tech things like using, stuff on their computer that can help them access, having access to audiobooks, text to speech, speech to text, Grammarly. There's so many different things out there. So those are kind of the two differences: communication versus access to academics.
Yeah, that makes sense. And when should parents consider requesting these kinds of assessments if the district hasn't offered them up?
So for assistive communication, I would say anytime there's concerns with your child's ability to functionally communicate their needs and wants and or, respond and receive instruction due to a language, barrier, and other things haven't proven to be successful. So, the speech language pathologist has assessed, and maybe they might recommend it right off the bat, and or we've kind of had these speech services in place and there's just minimal progress, and my child still isn't really making much progress in terms of their ability to communicate or, have respond to other people's communications with them. So that's the AAC piece for assistive tech. It's really often commonly used, I would say, for individuals with Down syndrome. It's a really good assessment to look into, and also individuals who have like specific learning disabilities, particularly with reading and writing, and also math. But there's so many pieces that can support reading and writing nowadays that are like mind-blowing, like so many cool things, that students, and it's so common now. Like, it's not like it stands out. Like, everyone has a laptop now at school, right? Or everyone has a technological device. So it's not things that are making them look different. So that's really cool too.
Yeah, that's great. And Carrie in the chat asked a little earlier, that I think fits in with this. Have you heard of doing an AAC evaluation on a student that can speak but struggles to show knowledge?
An AAC assessment. I'm not sure if I understand the question fully, but AAC can definitely be used not solely for the purpose of just, it doesn't have to be their primary mode of communication. So the student can absolutely be vocal, but maybe they require a little bit more supports, like participating in whole group instruction. So being able to answer the questions. So the device can be set up so it's like specific to whatever the lesson is for that day, if that's kind of what she's asking, and it helps them to be more participatory. But it's not that they have to, they can still vocalize, you know what I mean?
Right.
I think somebody wrote, I don't know where this comment, who to attribute who this comment, but it said, so AT is for access and AAC is showing knowledge. Is that correct?
I mean, I think AAC also helps students access. They have to be able to communicate to access their environment. I mean, it helps them access their wants, their needs, to be able to participate, to be able to socialize. So I think they're both
a little bit both.
Yeah.
Right. And well, another, probably the most questions that we get about any assessment is about FBAs, or functional behavioral assessments. So again, if you can explain what that is and when a child qualifies and when they don't.
Yeah, this could be a whole which
Yeah.
within itself.
Yeah, we should probably have a whole different, like whole session on FBAs, really. Yeah.
Yeah. So an FBA stands for functional behavior assessment. It's so the short answer is, in order for a student to have a behavior intervention plan, they don't have to be in special education. It's a gen ed service. So there's like different tiers of behavior plans. So the most commonly used that I'll refer to is a PBIP and a CBIP. You have a positive behavior intervention plan and a comprehensive behavior intervention plan. Some districts may refer to it as tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So the PBIP, or the lower tier, is much less comprehensive. It's much more straightforward, like a single page, doesn't require an FBA per like the law. So people can just put their heads together and develop this plan to support a student, right? If you need a comprehensive behavior plan, it requires an FBA. So that's one way in which the FBA would be triggered. If this PBIP isn't working, it's proven to not be effective, we're still seeing behaviors, we need more data. As a BCBA, personally, anytime there's behavior, we want data, right? So I always push for an FBA if, you know, it's something that requires some level of a plan, because, you know, like ethically, it doesn't really make sense to develop a plan if we don't know why and what's happening. Now, I also think it's important to point out that it also depends on like the eligibility or a medical diagnosis outside. Like a lot of what I see oftentimes, particularly for like ADHD, is we're like writing these behavior plans for kids who are off task and inattentive and distractible, when it's like part of who they are and it's part of their disability. So keeping that in mind and making sure that the assessment is taking that into consideration. And I will say like 99.9% of assessments I see in the area of behavior don't do that. They're very straightforward, very surface level, just looking at the 4 functions. Is it for access, escape, da, 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 da. Doesn't take into consideration anything internal. You know, is there emotionality tied to it? And the most common goal I see is, let's teach the kid to ask for a break. And then what happens is we're teaching these kids to ask for breaks, and then they're asking for breaks all the time. And then we're having behaviors because we have to bring them back from breaks. So FBAs are great. I think they're necessary. I think they're poorly done. I think there's a shortage of behaviorists to adequately support the area. So for parents to know, just like with all the other assessments going in, you really need to know your child as a whole and make sure that the recommendations make sense. You're questioning how it's going to be supported, what strategies are going to be put in place. And also, first, even before all of that, looking at the environment. Is the environment even properly set up and conducive to helping your child? Because that could be the reason why. And once you fix that, they don't even have the behaviors anymore. So there's just so many pieces that go into it.
There's so many. And I have to ask, is it the district's responsibility to identify and assess a child who needs behavioral supports? Because I think it often feels like if a parent doesn't request it, some kids almost have to reach crisis mode before it's offered up. I mean, we're seeing that time and time again.
It absolutely is. It's the district's responsibility. It's part of, you know, it's part of the process. It's part of what's available. And I think what almost always happens is, rather than doing that, it's a request for a move to a more restrictive setting. So kind of going back to the inclusion piece, if we have a kid in gen ed and they're having these behaviors, and what happens when you have a kid in gen ed that's disruptive? The gen ed teacher is like, I can't do this. I have 30 kids. How am I? We need this kid out, or this kid needs help. Like someone needs to come in, and you know what I mean? So an inclusion specialist can go in and say, hold on, let's make sure that this student is being adequately supported. Maybe they don't even need an FBA. Maybe we shouldn't even be approaching it from that lens. Maybe we need to look at, what does this environment look like, and is it meeting the student's needs? So it's so quick to jump to just the student is the problem and we need to fix the student, when it could very well be many other things that are going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know we're running short on time, so be sure to get your questions into the chat window. We have a couple more questions here, and we'll get to those in the chat window as much as we can. We also want to hit on some of the lesser known or utilized assessments, just to bring the possibilities to life in a way that's relevant, obviously, like you said earlier, for families. So one hot topic that's been active in our community is social rec, and the recent funding that's come back and regional centers around social rec. There are also recreational assessments in the list you shared for educational purposes. Can you explain those and who and what qualifies?
Yeah, so most people don't know that it's a thing. It is a thing, and it's basically for students who struggle with accessing that area, recreation and leisure and social interaction in the form of that type of play. So, obviously autism is a big one, right? We're thinking of students on the spectrum that struggle with joining in those types of groups and accessing those types of activities. So if the school is not able to basically meet the needs of that area of deficit some way on campus, they can absolutely provide and fund outside recreational activities and or contract with other partners, community partners to provide that need. And so having that recreation and leisure therapy, recreation therapist is what it would be called, come in to do that assessment is really helpful to help either figure out how to meet that need on campus or if there's going to be a way to do that off campus.
I love that. I would also love to hear from families. Let us know, like, if you've used that successfully. I would love to hear more stories because, yeah, it's very, very rare for parents to know to ask and then to get it. So we would love to hear, like, share the stories. And all of this is leading up to sort of the pivotal question of what if we disagree, right? We read these assessments and we don't feel like they represent our child, or, we don't feel like they're getting to where we need to be. So what do we do?
Yeah, again, you're a meaningful member of the IEP team. You have the right to disagree. You do not have to agree. You don't have to consent. California is a dual consent state, so they can't move forward with anything without your consent unless they file due process and they win. That would be the only way. If you disagree and you really feel strongly that they got it wrong, you have the option to request that they conduct more testing. Maybe there were pieces that were missing. Like I said, the ADOS, you can have them go back and redo it. If you feel like you just don't want to deal with the district anymore and you don't trust that they're able to complete a valid and reliable assessment, you always have the right to request an IEE, knowing going into that the district can deny it. And if they deny, they do have to then file due process to prove that their assessment is valid. It's very rare that happens, but it can happen. And I also think, though, that I have seen parents where they're very strongly in disagreement and they're trying to fight for services. And the examples they show, like, for example, writing, it's very legible and it looks good. And sometimes maybe they're wanting something super perfect. And that's not the purpose of special education. The purpose is to ensure that the student is able to access, not to be the best student in the room. So keeping that in mind, if you're really feeling strongly that something's off, go in and observe and make sure that you have something to back that up. Have someone go in and observe and make sure that there's reason for you to support that disagreement. If it's close, there's times where it's just totally out of the water, there's no way. So that just file or request the IEE. But sometimes it's like, I don't know. So go in and observe.
And before you jump to an IEE, is there an sort of a middle phase of where you're looking at it? There's some red flags, you ask questions, they're like, oh, okay, so we didn't observe like in multiple settings for enough time, like we'll go back. I mean, should we, be open and collaborative and allow them to do that so we can see their final assessment? I mean, if they're willing to work with us, if there are things like that, they just sort of.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I said first, is if you're willing to give them a chance, they can always go back and add more assessments like the ADOS if you want more observations. But if you've done it time and time again and you just are like, I'm done, then, if you feel strongly that there's enough reason, request the IEE.
Yep.
That's great. And we had a couple of questions come in. I know one was about where can parents find a list of different assessments used and what each address. We actually can share the link, Donna, if you want to share that again, because I know some people came in late. That'd be helpful. And then you mentioned this when we were talking about the FBA, but the idea of bringing in an inclusion specialist was somebody was just confirming. Do you when would you ask for that? Would you ask that before the FBA, after the FBA?
So I know, I do IEE FBAs, and I've done my FBAs, and that was my recommendation. I don't think that this is an issue that this student has these, disruptive maladaptive behaviors that we need to do all these behavior strategies, I think that the environment is not conducive to this child being able to learn. So my recommendation is an inclusion specialist. So, you know, again, if the parent has gone in and observed and they have those concerns, then they can make that request to have that done first, and then follow up with the FBA if the behaviors continue, or if you have a good FBA assessor, then they may make that recommendation themselves.
Makes sense.
I know we are running on low on time, but there is one question I really wanted to ask that came in beforehand, and we can just do it really fast. But
Yeah.
I think that a lot. What? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say for Jason's question, I know the list, the link, it's just the types of assessments. If that person is looking for actual like testing instruments, there's a book written by Pete Wright. It's on like all the different types of assessments in terms of the actual instruments. So that may be a good resource as well.
Cool.
That's great. So I just want to ask this really fast, because when I just looked at this, I think a lot of parents could be in this boat. And it's just, she said the whole school's been testing using MAP instead of state testing. The school said they did it to assess learning loss. My son couldn't even respond to the test. There were no accommodations. He's on the alternative assessment for state testing, which they didn't do. They just gave him a score of 0, which is useless. So how can we assess his learning loss? So I know that's a little different, but when I read that, I worried, because that could be a lot of our kids. And so it really feels like possibly kids with disabilities that are getting left out of that conversation. Is there anything that you want to throw in about that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of assessing for learning loss, I think the best way would be to look at a couple ways, like looking at progress on previous goals in comparison to where he's at now. So that will help you kind of see if there's true regression, like if he was improving or meeting goals, and then we kind of probe those areas and there's regression. That's pretty straightforward data. As far as if you're looking at like state testing specifically, I mean, it sounds like he shouldn't have even been given that particular test anyway. He would be on the alternative test. So I don't necessarily think those are the best measures of learning loss. Personally, I think it would be more indicative of where, if there's true regression, to really more look at like his goals and whatever curriculum he's been accessing. And if he's, you know, there should be data from last year or even the year before to now. Hopefully the teacher's been taking data as far as how he's been performing within his classroom, and outside of just his IEP goals. There should be data, there should be work that you can be looking at to see if his performance has, you know, been consistent or not. I wouldn't just base it off of like any state testing necessarily.
Right.
I mean, kids have been out of school for so long, like so many kids kind of dipped on their state testing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they've truly regressed. So.
It's just alarming when you see like, yep, we'll just give your kid a 0 and that's okay. Yeah. And then there's no assessment for learning loss. So, you know, it's
a whole different, I wouldn't accept that, but.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pelangka, as always. You're helping us make our way through the assessment maze, and thinking about, you know, some key tips and guidelines for parents if they have concerns, how they can get in there and observe and build up the case as needed, but also think about different assessments that might be relevant to request. And your constant reminder, which is an important one, is you are a part of the IEP team. We are. And not losing sight of that, such that, you know, you can have that kind of confidence to go in and ask questions and make the case as needed. So thank you for that. And it's always wonderful to be enlightened. Now I think I can better explain the difference between AT and AAC. Don't quiz me on it, but I think I'm there.